9, 8.
You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
So, probably about 10 years ago, we're at C2E2, and I find a dealer that has my White Whale book at the time, and my business partner's White Whale book at the time, and our third partner at the time had brought a book with them that we had signed by several people and witnessed by the big grading companies. Luckily at the time I was working for one and my business partner was working for the other. So, the witnessing was easy. And so we bought all of our books and we went to turn them in and we sent them in and everything was great. And then a few months later, they came back, but I was the one who got the package. My other two partners were not there. So I hid the books. And I showed them mine. Hey, my book came back. My book came back. I have bad news about your books. And I said to my partner, Alex, at the time, I said, Alex, you sent a Chrome ASM 300 in to get graded, and it came back not Chrome. Apparently the Chrome was fake, so CGC just took it off. And when he realized that I was pulling his leg, he was angry, but decided to help me get in on pranking Amanda, our other partner. So he hid her book and told her that there had been an incident at CGC and they had stepped on her book. It had fallen off a table. They had stepped on her book and torn the cover. And that what should have been a 9/8 first appearance of Red Sonja signed by everybody living that had anything to do with it was like a 2 now. And you see the color drain from her face. And she grabs the cart of stuff she had to go stock in the store. And she walks away, and you could just see from her mannerisms that she was crying. So I go to where we hid the book, and I pull it out, and I go, luckily, I found this book that's exactly the same book, signed by the exact same people, submitted the exact same day on the exact same invoice number that came back at a 9/8. And she hit me across the face with an omnibus. Best prank I ever pulled. I don't know that that's the case with CGC now, but let's just all hope we can wake up tomorrow and everything's a prank. This is Devil's Advocates. Welcome back. Why are your Christmas lights still up?
Because we decorated late this year because of scheduling stuff. So my wife just went out of town. For those that know the Copper Age Babe, that's my wife. She is currently just landed in Atlanta, so she's out of town. So the kiddo and I are going to de-decorate Christmas over the next couple of days and get rid of it. But yeah, it's just one of those things where we want to leave it pretty late.
In that first week after Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, works for me.
Yeah.
But no, my Christmas lights and stuff came down January 20 or December 26th. So
when do you put yours up? Because you're not a very big Christmas guy, right? So
December 23rd.
Okay, there we go. I'm a wait till after Thanksgiving person, but we waited till like the second week of December, I think, this year, which is really late for us.
No, I had a job for about 15 years that required me to think about Christmas in August. So screw that.
Yeah.
100%. All right. So today's topic is a tough one.
Pretty much.
Or not.
I think it's tough for the community as a whole because there's different people approaching it from different angles. And that's actually the interesting thing with this is there's probably a lot of people that have been waiting for me to talk about this. I haven't publicly spoken about the CGC scam or the CGC scandal or whatever people want to call it. I'm sure it's going to be called Reholder Gate any second now, especially now that I said that. And I actually haven't had much to say about it because I don't think it's as big of a deal as people are making it out to be because of my perspective on the matter. But I understand that a lot of people have different feelings about it. And I think it's going to be really cool to dive into it and explore those angles that people do have regarding this. And I think that even more beyond the specific issue that brought this story to our attention today, that the reason why we're talking about it right now, there also is going to be some cool things to talk about with certification and the whole process of grading collectibles in general.
Right. The reason I want to talk about it, I mean, for me is, and this is what I've said from day one, I think that grading is a important part of the business that we've made a level of important that it should never have been. I think grading comics is super important because it is one of the best ways to ensure that you've preserved your collectible in the best possible way, right? It should never have been this economical driving factor that has become.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it definitely, one thing that I think people may not give enough credit is, and I think I see this a little bit more uniquely because of how and when I came back into the comic book collecting hobby. Over the pandemic years, 2020 to 2020, the beginning of 2023, let's call it even that, because you have that kind of weird taper off effect that happened. Even leading into that a little bit, comic books were starting to become the next collectible that was due for a push after sports cards have been seeing kind of a revival of interest. Pokemon gaming cards have been seeing a revival of interest, and comic books were right in line with that, right? I think that because of the COVID boom, and you can argue why that happened, but I think that's a fair thing to call it because of the timing, if not because of the cause and effect. Because of that, CGC and CBCS and other comic book grading companies, but in particular CGC, received a huge amount of attention because you had an influx of people investing in comic books and people that thought about the value of comic books disproportionate to the amount they thought of it as a collectible hobby.
Right.
And that ratio got out of skew. And so because of that, CGC's been in the limelight for a few years now and had other scandals, other scams, other things that have come to attention and received kind of the limelight. So I think that this is really actually just kind of a domino chain effect kind of a thing, maybe near the end of that chain. And I think that it's gonna be really interesting to talk about some of the motivations that people have for grading collectibles and whether or not those are still valid and those sorts of things. But yeah, it when people do it to increase the value of a comic book, that never made sense to me, right? Like if I have an X-Men 1 3.5 raw or graded, if it's really a raw 3.5, I think that the difference of grade and value there should be pretty minimal because we're saying that it's a 3.5, which we're saying that that's the grade it has. Now you could maybe ascribe a little extra value for the pages have been counted, it's been checked for restoration, those sorts of things. But really, it should be in line. So then you saw this boom, and this is the thing I think we really need to talk about. You saw this huge boom in these comic books where the graded example was worth 5x, 10x the raw example. And that doesn't make sense to me. That's a completely skewed thing. So I agree. I think that's an important.
No, it's true. I mean, I think, and for a long time, I would tell customers who brought books into my store wanting to get them graded, look, if you're getting this graded because you think the process of getting it graded will make the book worth more than the plastic that is the encapsulation, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. Right? Because for every book you send off to get graded, there are 10 books out there that you could also get graded that won't be worth the paper they're printed on. So when we talk about grading as a method of economic growth, then to me, it seems like that same idea of I have this really rare thing. I'm going to put one on the market and say there's only one available, even though I have 100. And we can get into some of that more later, but
Yeah.
I see Sean's comment that he has no idea what's really going on.
Yeah.
So should we paint the picture for everybody?
In fact, and before we even do that, hey, 2024, this is actually, by the way, welcome back, audience. This is our first show of 2024. One habit I want to get into is saying hello to the people that pop up in chat, especially at the beginning of the show. My hat's off to the folks that come in here and they want to say hi. So just real fast, Thomas R. Bishop, you're in the chat. Thanks for being here. TJ James, Reef the Sea Forever, Kenneth Bird. We got Jay holding it down with some comments and some fantastic hashtag creation going on here. And then we get to Sean's comment, which we definitely will bring right back up. Phil, nice to see you here, Phil. Frog Brawler in the house. So we appreciate all the folks in the chat.
We have, I think it's Poyo's Comics, which, do you have chickens and comics, Poyo's Comics? Can you set that up for me? Over there on Instagram. We also have Comics Guy, Curtis Stelfox, Frosty Mugs, Comics and more. Also, do you sell beer with comics or have beer with comics? Because I would be interested in that.
At least a nice cream soda, like a nice batch cream soda or a root beer. I can get by that.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that.
But real quick, because we're calling them out. Dan Priced, Skunk Snot, which is a great username.
I like Skunk. That's like an old Xbox gamer tag right there.
Conlin Comics, and Kenneth is over on Instagram too.
And we got Short Circuit just hopped in our chat here. Aloha. What's Mel? Okay,
no, I just had a long conversation with Nick about you.
Ooh, his ears must be burning.
No, Mel and I are going to do something really cool as part of something we're announcing tomorrow.
Well, that could be a good thing. That could be a good thing. So Sean, I 100% want to. This is actually the additional part of what I was going to say. It's funny because, again, I think a lot of people, the kind of stuff I do, I cover a lot of comic book collecting news, which is kind of a weird niche, right? But things that happen in the collecting part of the hobby. So that can include things like scandals and scams that come up, unfortunately. Things like, creators that are in this space that are making their own comic books, things like that, right? And speculation investment. I've covered all that kind of stuff, as well as interviews and all kinds of different content. If you're not familiar with my stuff over on my channel. But this is the kind of thing that normally I would have covered, and I didn't cover it. And I also barely have paid attention to this story, other than the fact that just by the position that I'm in the comic book community, a lot of information has just come through my social media feeds. So I'm actually in a unique spot where I don't know every beat and detail about this. I haven't watched hour-long streams and, Swaggle House's videos. But the one I did watch was the 99 Newsstands original video that he put out. And I hope I got that name right, but he's the gentleman that broke the story over on Instagram that a lot of people kind of picked up on. So I went right to the source that it came out from first, kind of absorbed that content. And I know a lot of information has been revealed after that. The funny thing is, even though I haven't been paying attention, I still think I know a decent amount about this. So we can definitely try to educate you here, Sean. The core of this particular controversy, and this is my elevator pitch synopsis for the movie of the week that's going to come out for this particular topic, is that at least one primary seller or submitter has been taking slabs, which, if you don't know, consist of an outer plastic shell from CGC and an inner well plastic insert, essentially, and taking the cracking the outer shell, pulling that inner well out, and then let's say that comic book was an Amazing Spider-Man 252, first appearance of the black suit, tied, whatever you want to call it. There was a Mark Jewelers insert at a 9.4. Pulling that book out and putting in like a 7.0 or a 7.5 non-Mark Jewelers variant, and then selling that book, reselling it up, selling that book, sending it off to CGC, getting it reholdered, and saying that the slab was damaged. So they would just reslab it, apparently not noticing that the book inside was a Mark Jewelers insert. And then they have that book, and then they would send off the Mark Jewelers insert that they pulled out of there and get that holdered as a submission. And so now they have two copies that say they're Mark Jewelers at a high grade, and they're able to sell both, even though only one was actually a legitimate Mark Jewelers insert. That's one of the things that has been happening. That's kind of the gist of the scam.
As we go forward, Reef, you're commenting a lot, buddy, and I love it. But I wanna caution you against your last comment. You said it wasn't just one seller as well. It was a known presser and a comic book store in New York. Read the CGC. We're not going to name anybody.
Yeah,
we're not going to call anybody out. We're not going to put any of that kind of stuff. By the way, I have the planet Saturn on my forehead because I'm 13, apparently. And it's making me nuts looking at
I didn't notice until you pointed, because to me, it just looked like a highlight on the lighting or something. But
no, like I have the planet Saturn on my forehead. Anyway, we're not going to call anybody out. The reality is that there's no way to know until we know who all was involved, how big how deep the rabbit hole goes, how big the actual problem is. We are almost certain it wasn't just one person. Like, I guarantee you it wasn't just one person, but I don't want to. Part of the things we do here on the experiences, we're talking about this from an opinion standpoint, but we're also trying to be as factual as possible. So I don't want to name any names. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. I don't want to imply anything that we don't know for fact. And unfortunately, until the charges come out or whatever, I want to just be very careful in that realm, right?
Yeah. And moreover, I just want to, just in the interest of sharing complete information and getting that out there and addressing points like what Reef is saying, to the press release or the public information that CGC has put out there, they are talking about an individual at this point. Now, that does not mean that there are not more people involved in this. Like Kyle said, you could almost guarantee there are more people involved in this. In fact, I am personally aware of a separate scam that is, I will talk about it without naming names, because that person makes videos on YouTube about it, where they're sending in, what is it? Is ASM, is it 232? What's the first appearance of Hobgoblin? The number's escaping me off the top of my head. The tattoo.
Oh, God. I have to. Nick, you're here. First appearance of Hobgoblin and Spider-Man. You know that number off the top of your head, I'm sure.
For some reason, it's just not rolling through my head correctly. I don't know why. Sorry, folks. 238. I wanted to say 232 because of 252. My bad. Thank you, Frog and Reef. So 238. So there's a person out there who is and they're making videos about it. They're inserting tattoos into copies of 238 and then sending those off to CGC to get submitted as a complete copy. And they're literally marrying tattoos into that book and sending them off and according to them, getting blue labels back. So that is an extension of this type of topic of what we're talking about. Right. When it comes to the verification and validation of submitting a comic book or maybe more importantly, purchasing or receiving a comic book that has been graded at a certain level, condition, color of label, all those sorts of things. So yes, of course, Reef, you're right. There are probably extra folks out there doing this. I think the idea of how widespread it is a salient point to this conversation, but quantifying that is going to be nearly impossible or pretty much impossible at this point. So there's no reason to really get caught up on that part of the equation.
And here's how I look at this when we talk about how big or how deep this rabbit hole goes. Always remember that if you go to any town in the Midwest and you bring up Al Capone, somebody knows somebody who is in the Capone gang.
Yeah.
Right? It was so big. There were so many people, but the only name you know is Capone. Right? And if you're really into mobsters, you maybe know a couple of other bosses, but for the, it's been a thing. So I want to hesitate implying that there's anything other than what we know for a fact is being called out specifically by CGC. And right, 238 has always been a scam book.
Yeah, 100%.
It's been a nightmare. In fact, I have a policy in my store, or I had a policy in my store for a long time. I would not buy 238. Just because, especially if I couldn't go through them and see go through them first. Yeah. So if I had somebody say, "Hey, I've got all these books. Are you interested in them?" I won't buy them. Like if a 238's in there, unless you bring it in and I can go through it first. So it's been a thing for a long time. 238's just
100%.
So the question of today's show is, can you trust CGC? And what I wonder, and this is something that I'm going to throw out there, is this all a F around and find out situation? And what I mean by that is we put, as comic book fans and dealers and collectors, we put so much faith in the process of grading, in the process of encapsulation, that we forgot to do our own due diligence, that we forgot that everything on every level that you do is open to manipulation, is open to potentially being a scam.
Yep.
I mean, you ever go pump gas and notice how there's always those little tape lines all over the gas pump that says this has been checked by your county auditor? Did you know that it's because in the old days they would go into those gas pumps and turn down how much dispensed per click or whatever of the thing, so it would show you were getting more gas than you were actually getting? Like, everything is subject to manipulation. So I guess my question is did we set ourselves up for this? And now how do we come back from it? Because like, as Mel said earlier, is there a way to make this scam proof going forward?
And I think that is, I love the comment. It's something I think that we should explore near the end of the time that we have, because I think that, pretty standard format for our show is we bring up the topic. Kyle and I will kind of go back and forth on where we agree and disagree on the points of the issue. And then we try to end on a positive note as far as, even if that positive note is constructive criticism, right? Like, how can we fix this? How can we make this better? What kind of suggestions can either of us and the chat, you guys out there, bring to the table to help fix the issue? And so I think that's something that we definitely should come back to. Do you agree with that, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder, guys, I will be bringing up the comments from Instagram separately. We obviously can't pop them up on screen like we can some of the others because of the way Instagram works right now, but we will bring up all those questions, including a great one now from Skunk Snot. Excellent.
And so the part I do want to talk about, though, about getting to the topic, can you trust CGC, and then kind of the shadow question we've kind of tacked onto it is, have we given grading collectibles, or especially specifically grading comic books, too much credit? And here's the element I would talk about with that. I think that like I mentioned, we saw comic books kind of reach this collecting renaissance or speculative renaissance when it comes to value and people trying to buy and sell comic books. And part of that, I think, things like CGC, and we could just as easily be talking about CBCS, by the way. In fact, for all we know, stuff like this is happening at CBCS. No one can sit here and say that's, you just talk about being limited to one person doing it. Could easily be happening at all the grading companies for all we know, or something similar to it, or different types of variations.
And in fact, there's one grading company that I would argue should be doing it because it would make them relevant again.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is, I think we get to, you look at sports cards, which kind of had their moment in the sun a little bit before comic books did. And when you get to sports cards, talk about controversies, drama, scams, there's tons. But I think that there's a little bit more faith in the idea of grading sports cards, in the fact that, well, I guarantee you, people try to forge signatures, people try to forge, inserts, all that stuff. It is essentially a two-dimensional,
it's a single
piece of cardboard. Right. To some extent, the actual, I guess you'd call it the printer, or in this case, the card company, is saying what numbers are supposed to be out there. Now, I also know that isn't always accurate, but there's more transparency into some of those things than there are into comic books, where, again, comic books have multiple wraps, multiple points of failure, multiple extra ways of restoration. I know people try to restore and press cards and stuff like that too. But again, there's more layers of complexity and that's one of the reasons people talk about AI or digital grading of comic books. It will be much harder because there's so much more involved in looking at the entirety of the comic book versus looking at a sports card and putting that out there. So I think when you talk about that false sense of security, I think that people maybe sort of thought, well, all these, PSA and SGC and all these different companies have been doing sports cards for so long, and look at the success rate. Look at the extra value that's been added to some of those sports cards when it's a Gem Mint 10 versus even a one lower grade is death in sports cards in a lot of circumstances when it comes to moderns. Just like a 9.8 is kind of the gold standard in comic books, right? So I think that you have to really look at that. Are we placing too much faith in it? And I think the answer to that is it depends. But if you want to look at it in aggregate, the community certainly was placing this huge commodity on 9.8 graded modern comic books, especially. You could argue that's probably the least important thing to focus on for graded comic books. Like, I care way more about, I gave that 3.5 X-Men 1 example earlier. I care way more about that being graded a 3.5 by CGC or any of the other grading companies than I do the 1 in 100 ASM that just came out or whatever last month being a 9.8. Because moderns are the margin of error is so much smaller, and people put this weird artificial importance on 9.8 versus 9.6 or 9.9 or 9.4 when those are all near mint or near mint plus type categories, right? So it is interesting how we look at things that way, and I think that we have to ask ourselves, why does that matter? And I will tell you, as somebody who gets on a camera and goes online and talks about comic books, and some people call those people influencers. I don't agree that even the most prominent member of my community, I don't think is an influencer in the traditional sense of the word, but I know some people view them that way. I can tell you that there are influencers within the niche of things that I do that years ago were talking about 9.8s and why they're important and why they should be valued more than other comic books. And I think that people maybe collectively were allowed to be influenced into thinking that that was something that mattered more than it does. And having that grade, having that seal of approval matters. Whereas, again, a comment that was brought up earlier, it should be more about leveling the playing field between dealers and collectors, right? Having an impartial third party look at the book and review it for restoration or review it for completion. I think that makes more sense when you're talking about buying something online. You're talking about buying something from across the country at a convention where, especially we're talking like a $1 million, AF-15 Action Comics, those kinds of comic books. I can see the need for having a third party look at that. But I think putting all the faith in the grading company is where you run amok there, because that, again, should just be another opinion. That shouldn't be law or fact or, well, that's what it is. I mean, how many times have you heard people in this hobby say, buy the book, not the grade? Look at the comic book inside the holder as much as you can. And if you don't trust it or something seems off, or that there's a potential issue there, you have to take that into consideration.
So two things I want to mention here. And first of all, I'm going to say it. We're within the part where I can start to cuss. 9.8s are bullshit.
Yeah.
They are.
Yeah.
Just plain and simple. They are.
It's stupid. It makes no sense.
They are a thing that was arbitrarily decided by people was the gold standard.
Yeah.
Guess what? If you show me a 9.8 of some of the books that I want to collect, I'm going to tell you you're lying. Because they don't exist.
Right.
They just don't.
Or there might be one on the census out there or something like that.
Single digit X-Men's, you're not going to find in a 9.8. And if you do, you're being ripped off. Like, just plain and simple. They don't exist. Like, it's this thing that, again, and it goes back to, in my opinion, and I'm going to call out someone that I'm a big fan of here. It goes back to Dynamic Forces selling comics on QVC or HSN, right? It was this idea that, hey, we have these things that are signed and certified. Great. Well, now we know. It used to be a COA was good enough to prove that everything was legit. And then anybody started printing up their COA. So everybody saw what Dynamic Forces was doing and trusted it, right? Because you don't get on HSN if you're selling scams.
Yeah.
Right? And they're the same company doing the same thing now. But now everything is so colored by, well, is it a 9.8? Who gives a shit? Dan Jurgens signed the Superman book. Do you want to sign Superman book or not? Plain and simple, right?
Oh, and by the way, real fast to your point, because I guarantee you there's people in chat right now saying, oh, well, at least if it's a CGC yellow label, I know someone witnessed that signature. No, it doesn't mean that. That is an absolute fallacy as well. The artists themselves can send that book in. A witness at a con can make mistakes.
Right.
That does not mean that somebody actually saw it. Now, does it increase the likelihood that somebody actually saw it? Sure. But that doesn't mean what that means.
I've had relationships with CGC witnesses so long that they let me witness my own books. Like
points of failure in the system.
Now, I'm not going to go and say, hey, I got this signed by Neil Adams and not have gotten it signed by Neil Adams. And instead it's me with a Sharpie. But at the same time, that is a breakdown in the system. You know, like it is. So the second thing is this. And this is what really has irked me about this whole system for a long time. It's not transparent. We've talked about this on this show before. I don't know what the grader is going to do when they get my book.
Yep.
I don't know. Do they feel like I feel right now with a migraine and a cold and I want to be in bed? Or are they excited to be grading comics today? Did they have their Mountain Dew this morning? Did they fight with their wife last night?
Did they make up with their wives last night, as the common saying goes?
Right.
Yeah.
There's not a clear rubric that everybody has to follow, and you don't get those results. All you get is your final score, and if you're lucky, grader notes.
Right, and
if you're lucky,
dude, and that is a seriously important point here, because throughout every scandal or scam that is involved tangentially or directly CGC and CBCS for that matter, there are breakdowns in transparency that for a company that is certifying collectibles makes no sense to me.
Right.
Every part of the process of how it's graded, why it's graded what it is, and the notes that are included on that, anything below a 10 should be included automatic. I know CBCS is better at the graders notes, that's specific to CGC, but that makes no sense. You need to have that transparency if you want to have trust.
Right. So here's the line that I've drawn here. I somehow on TikTok got into the Rolex talk part of TikTok, which are these guys who run around the Diamond District in New York buying and selling and flipping Rolexes.
Oh, wow. That's probably fascinating.
It is, but take a Rolex out of their hand and put a comic book in their hand, and it's the exact same game that a lot of people are playing right now with comics. They're investing in comics, trying to make a quick buck. I bought it now. I got it graded. I've had it for 15 minutes. Now let me try and make as much money as possible off of it. Right? So here's the thing about the Rolex game that's interesting and why it is fascinating. Every one of these jewelry dealers who deal in these big, expensive, high-end watches know how to tell if it's real or not. And they can open it up and they can crack it and they can say, this is the right stuff. This is the right movement. That's the right dial. That's the right lens. That's the right bezel. That's the right everything, right?
Okay.
They know how to tell if when they're handed a watch, it's a real Rolex or it's a fake Rolex. Like, but you can't do that with a comic book. You hand me an ASM 15 or an AF 15 in a slab. I can't flip through it and make sure it's an AF-15 inside. I can't look at any of the things that I need to look at to be able to truly know if what you're handing me is what you're handing me, if it's graded.
Mm-hmm.
So you're forcing me to trust that piece of paper at the top because you've taken my ability. What up, Mad Spidey? You've taken my ability as an expert in comic books, right? An expert in comic books. You've taken my ability to judge whether the comic book is real or not out of my own hands. And
True.
that is a very dangerous game that we've chosen to play. And so I think there's this idea that hubris has won out here. Our own desire to make as much money as possible, as fast as possible, is our eventual undoing. Right? The fact is, if we had all played the game and kept the books a long time and waited for the value to go up, down, and then moved them in that regard, this thing would not be the same as it is now. Reef the Sea Forever.
Yeah.
I know they exist. Yes. I've seen them.
Yes. And there is, in fact, comics that are sold that way. People know about them. And then they slab them intentionally. And that is the fun world of cosplay covers and stuff like that too, let alone what you're actually talking about, I'm sure. But yeah, so it is a weird hobby we have. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I love Bad Idea. Shout out to my dude Adam Freeman at Bad Idea and Dinesh, my friend at my friends at Bad Idea.
They're cool cats. I
thought it was brilliant marketing, but the amount of people who got mad about it just made me itchy.
I mean, it's in the name, the whole point of Bad Idea, and I do despise many of the things they do, but it's the whole idea of it literally, and it is there's no such thing as bad press sort of mentality, and that's, hey, you got to respect somebody out there doing it. It's kind of fun setting those boundaries or breaking those barriers.
So over on Instagram, Skunk Snot says, I have a signed comic with about 25 signatures and I can't because it was done back in 1992. You can, but you have to go to CBCS where they do signature verification and some other things that, you can't CGC it and get a gold label.
Not a gold label. You can CGC it and get a green label.
Right. And you can CBCS it and get, is it still a red label? I haven't done it in so long.
If you don't get the verification?
No, if you get it verified.
If you get it verified, it's a yellow label, and they use the terms authenticated and witnessed, I believe, are their two different.
Yeah, it used to be a red label for authenticated.
Right. They changed that when they added the different process that they have now in the current submission process.
Yeah. No. So
which is better, I think. Because they're still distinguishing which it is on the label, at least.
Yeah, so I think it's time to kind of dive into some of these comments.
Yeah, I think so too. Let's start with some of the comments we had started, I think.
Yeah. So I want to dispel a little bit of something here. It wasn't created to level the playing field between sellers and collectors. It was created to, well, I should say, I feel like level the playing field is the wrong words. It was created to limit the amount of questions between sellers and collectors, especially on eBay in the early 2000s. Like, I'm with you on that, but it wasn't to level the playing field, because in every case, the playing field is already level. It's not an uneven playing field between a seller and a collector, because a seller has a product and they need to sell it to make money, and a collector has the money and wants the product. So one side, you can't be a seller if there are no collectors. So the playing field is level, but what it did was it took my ability as a seller to inflate or deflate my values away from me. And it gave more opportunity to collectors to be treated honestly. So I agree with you in what you're saying, but I think that I just wanted to call out level the playing field maybe as a wrongish term.
I think it's a bit of semantics, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think you guys are both on the same page, though, and I think that there is, as far as the core of what you're saying, and I think that's a good point to keep in mind is, and it's extremely important actually, is what is your purpose for encapsulating your comic books or buying encapsulated comic books?
Right.
And it's something I talk about a lot. I talked about it a lot before any of this happened. And we'll talk about it again at some point. You can even go back and watch one of our streams called To Slab or Not to Slab. I really recommend that stream. I think it was a great one we did. That I'm sure we'll revisit in chunks like we are right now. But yeah, it's an important point when it comes to this whole idea.
Skunk Snot says, I have a J. Scott Campbell back when he used to sign as Jeffrey Scott. If you've known him long enough, he still will. The whole slabbing thing has created a false commodity by creating a quantified value rather than an individual right. The thing is, whenever you take individual judgment and individual determinants out of the equation by saying this is what it is, this is what it's worth, this is the, by putting a grade on it, and then having outlets like they're an easy target, but I like them being an easy target, Key Collector, telling people what a graded copy of something is worth, you take your own self-determinants out of it.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you put a GSX #1 in front of me, right? Giant Size X-Men #1. It has a different value to me than it does to Bronze. Because he's an X-Men guy and I'm less of an X-Men guy. Right? Or we'll make it even clearer, because this is a book that really does have this kind of fluctuation. The silent issue of G.I. Joe.
Mm-hmm.
You put a 9.8 in front of me. Okay, it's a 9.8 G.I. Joe silent issue. Yay. You put it in front of Bronze, and that's something he's going to consider keeping rather than flipping. Because it's something he's into.
Especially the second printing, not the third printing, the second printing. And if you know, and that's half the battle. No, the second printing of G.I. Joe 21 is a real thing. If you don't know,
I know.
Rare.
But I don't have it in me because I just had this debate over the holidays with my brother-in-law.
Okay, fair enough.
Is a whole thing.
For those that don't know, what most people think of when they see the black Spidey head in the direct box, most of those, 99% of those are actually the third printing, not the second printing. So
right. No, so again, when you take your own ability to value something out of the equation, you're leaving yourself open to being manipulated by someone who just wants your money.
Yeah.
Again, I would pay a lot more for a Sandman #1 9.8 signed by everybody than perhaps Bronze would, because that's something that's going to stay with me.
Bad example. I love that book and it means a lot to me, but point taken.
Right. So
here's where I'll add some texture to this. I think that, when you're talking about how things are worded, and I think that it's a part of what we do on this show. We probably could change our name to the grammar advocates or something.
Right. Semantics are us.
Yeah. The whole slabbing thing has created a false commodity. Now, here's where I'll disagree with you. Even though I agree with what you're saying, TJ, the whole slabbing thing hasn't created a false commodity. People's perception of those slabbed comics has created a false commodity.
Right.
I think I'm not saying you didn't mean that when you said that, TJ, but just reading your comment 7 times on screen, that's what occurs to me, is that it's really more about the value we give. And by we, I mean the community, not Kyle and I, because we have different perspectives than probably most of the comic book community on graded comic books. But that's important.
Right. And right. The other problem is with this false commodity concept is that the census exists. because the census is in the same way that you can't really trust Overstreets to price your books because books sell so much faster than they can make Overstreets right now, at least the print versions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are several options that are coming for Overstreets that will limit this, but caveat. But
future conversations coming.
Right. But the census is inaccurate. You don't know how many 9.8 ASM 300s exist. You only know how many CGC has graded. Now, can you go out and say, okay, well, CGC has graded this many at 9.8, and CBCS has graded this many at 9.8, and PGX has graded this many at 9.8, but you know that ain't right. And X, Y, and Z, sure, but you don't have a full picture because you also don't know how many 9.8s I have raw in a box.
Or how many were resubmitted to either of those companies or cross-submitted to get a better grade or different grade or a different label. And that ties directly into this issue because there's if you look at the list of comics which are on CGC's forums or they're available on pretty much every drama huckster on Instagram or YouTube that loves talking about this stuff, and some legit people too. I'm being coy when I say that. You find the list of comic books, and one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of ASM 300 comic books were specifically submitted tons of times on this. Now, how many actual individual issues that affects becomes a little bit more of a gray area because part of this scam that we're talking about today that creates this conversation involved reholdering comic books. If you don't know exactly what that means, I mean, think about it. That means you took a comic book, either cracked it out or submitted it to be reholdered. And that if you do that and you don't send in the old label, they're not going to take the old one off the census if you don't know what that means. So,
right. So, right. It's you're always working with a partial data set.
I think the raw or graded should be the same price. We sort of talked about this a little bit. The only thing I would say is I understand adding a slight premium because I mean if you think sending in a comic book costs $25 or something like that or $30 or whatever it costs now, depending on the value of the comic and all that stuff. I think you could make the argument that it should at least add that value, assuming that it's to a reputable source that the buyer cares about.
Right. I have no problem with a book going up $50 because you got it graded.
Yeah.
Right. What I have a problem with is a book that's $100 being $1,000 once you get it graded.
Yes. Drastic swings in value. And in all honesty, I cannot think of an example off the top of my head, but there probably are some edge cases where if I had absolute faith in the grading company, that's the big caveat to what I'm about to say. Like that ASM 238. If I knew there was a company out there that could definitively tell me when tattoos had been married or not, for example, spoiler alert, there is not. But if I did have that faith, I might be willing to pay more for that service because they are doing some research into whether or not this has been discovered. Again, that comes into that matters to me as a buyer, and it's a service I'm willing to pay more for. Nobody's offering it, so it doesn't really matter. But there's some edge cases out there where I might pay a little bit more because I care specifically about the authenticity of the collectible in question. The extra little one I'll put on top of that is the witnessed yellow label. Even though I'm on the bandwagon of saying that those aren't always witnessed, there are certain times where I care that it was witnessed. But I famously told the story of how I bought an X-Men 16 after Stan Lee passed away because I really wanted an X-Men book that Stan Lee wrote that was signed by Stan Lee. And I did buy a yellow label because I was like, okay, this is going to increase the odds that was legitimately signed by Stan Lee. Right. And that mattered to me. So I was willing to pay a little bit more for that, for example.
Yeah. And I think it's a fair line to draw in the sand, right? Like I'm willing to pay extra for the certification that this book is exactly what I claim it to be or what the seller claims it to be. Right. Yeah. But not for the quality of the book. So I don't get to see a book beforehand. Send it to CGC to make sure that the Marvel value stamp's in it.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. I have no problem with paying for that service. So it's the other parts of it that give me the ick, as it were.
We already mentioned Sean's comment, so the one talking about not knowing what's going on. So I'm going to pass over that one and go right to another comment from Reef. because there's a couple things about this I want to touch on real fast. When Steve Borak left CGC became part of the problem. Okay, I'm going to get back to that. Acetate gate, higher prices. What is crazy is that the CGC cases are not UV rated, so you still need to put them in a magazine size Mylar. There's a few things about that I want to touch on, Reef. First of all, invoking Steve's name in this, I don't really think. Look, a lot of stuff happened under Steve's leadership at CBCS that I think it makes that part of this comment sticky to me, that in a way I'm not necessarily get into on stream. And I think a lot of people that Steve left behind at CGC were trusted proteges of Steve and very much part of his school of thought. And you know, not without getting into name and names and all that stuff. But what I did want to talk about is, you know, you can talk about acetate gate. Look, acetate gate, the only element of that I will say has any relevance to CGC is, should CGC be reaching out to the publisher on these exclusive comic books to determine if they're legitimate or not, to verify that beforehand, and should they even note it if it is or is not after the fact? Because that's one element that people leave by the wayside. And I can mention this because, not to toot my own horn, but I am the person that broke that Marvel did not know that Ultimate Fallout for acetate Clayton Crane cover. I'm the person that said that it wasn't authorized by Marvel, got verified by Marvel a couple weeks after that. And that is kind of the question there. The only thing that's a legitimate weird issue is that Black Flag Comic Books sent off 3 comic books to get graded by CGC, and they received, I forget the exact numbers, it was something like 5 10s, 5 9/9s, and 10 9/8s for each comic book. That's really weird that the math worked out that way, and I could see you wondering if there's some conspiracy going on with that, or some pay to play kind of stuff going on with that, because that seems odd. I don't think that had anything to do with the pre-screen in that particular case either. The only other thing I'll mention is the UV protection thing. Okay, look, couple things. I know somebody, he actually was in here earlier, Mad Spidey, if you're still here, shout it out. Mad Spidey worked in the lighting industry and knows a lot about this. If you keep your comic books in lighting that is inside and not exposed to direct sunlight, those cases are probably going to be fine. They're not going to be affected by especially LEDs, and most incandescents and most fluorescents are not going to affect them. There are some that do. There are many aftermarket solutions out there to protect your slabs or your comic books in general from UV, and CGC cases do block some UV light. It's a very small number, but also Mylar magazines don't necessarily block UV. So that's the other thing I wanted to correct about that. There are archival options out there that do block UV. That's not, you can't blanket say it's all Mylar though. So that's my point about that.
So I would also mention that CGC being part of the problem isn't really a thing. They're complicit, but it's not like we know at this moment that CGC has someone inside who's doing this, right? Like, that's like saying that banks having money are part of the problem for bank robbers, right? It's CGC is doing what we're paying CGC to do. And until we find out that there's somebody in the CGC team somewhere that is facilitating this scam, I don't want to say CGC is part of the problem. What has happened, and maybe this is what you mean by part of the problem, is that CGC has fed into its own hype.
Yes. That's how
that I will grant you. Right?
Yeah.
But show me a company that has success that doesn't buy into its own hype. I'm looking at the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs of recent. You know, but I mean,
thank you for not bringing up the Broncos in that for their 5-0 win streak in the middle of the season.
They're not buying into their own hype. They're firing their people anyway.
Which they should.
But what I'm getting at here is that one person at CGC is not going to stop a pandemic, is not going to stop a rabid collector market, is not going to stop dishonest people from entering the rabid collector market, and is not going to stop the proliferation of ways to buy things. Right? If all you could ever do was buy CGC slabs from CGC, right? Like if their whole thing was they buy these comics, they grade them, they sell them. One, you're going to be looking for these scams a lot earlier. But two, there's a point of cutoff, right? There's a point of disconnect. And so again, Steve Borak didn't keep this stuff from happening. It was likely happening under his watch. But again, we just don't know. So
yeah.
One simple task could have pretty much stopped this: re-examining requested reslab to ensure it is the same book as the label. But TJ James, let me throw this one on you. I bought it was a Batman #1, a new 52 Batman #1, the B cover. It was the cover that was done by an artist whose name I'm not going to say for reasons. And I sent it off and had it slabbed because it was signed by Snyder, Capullo, this artist, several other Batman luminaries that were, Dan DiDio had signed it, a bunch of folks.
Right on.
I get the slab back. I put it on the wall, and the subway next door, someone slammed a bathroom door and it fell off the wall and cracked. I don't want them re-examining my book. I want my 9.8 because that's what I'm got to sell that book at, right?
Yeah,
I don't really want them re-examining it when I'm the honest party, right? Because what if now it's a 9.6 because it fell off the wall? I don't want to take that hit as a seller. So while I agree with you, re-examining should be the policy, I can understand why people would argue against it. So that's all I have to say on that one. Like, I think people should re-examine requested reslabs, especially now, and especially on older books, right? Where you could be taking a book that doesn't have a Marvel value stamp and putting in one, or, taking out a book that does have a Marvel value stamp, putting in one that doesn't. Things like this that aren't checkable, right? I'm with you on that, but I can see the argument against it in a big way.
Man, I'm sorry. I have to vehemently disagree because as soon as that book was dropped, first of all, it doesn't mean and your comic book, I'm sure better than me, but it doesn't mean it necessarily was damaged.
Right.
As much as I don't think CGC slabs are great for protection, as far as compared to some other products that are out there, they do offer some additional protection, of course. But let's talk about the collector down the road who pass away. What's that?
I think you missed what I said, which is I agree with this, but I can see the argument against it, and that's
right. But I think it's very important that we bring this up because it is a huge part of what the community has had a problem with for so long, depending on which side of the equation they're on. Sellers don't want their comic books, people that are going to sell, don't want their comic books to be regraded. As a general, I'm speaking in very general terms here.
Right.
Whereas most buyers or collectors are going to say, well, that grade inside better be accurate to what that book is. Like that's what the buyer wants, the faith in that collectible. But there's a lot of people out there that say, like, if I send a comic book to be reholdered 10 years down the road, and it's a, let's say it's a Hulk 181 9.4, and it came back a 9.0, they are going to be pissed because that's frankly thousands of dollars, or depending on the market at the time, all stuff that could have been lost there. But here's the problem: is that people don't understand that CGC holder is not bulletproof. It's not going to perfectly encapsulate that comic book, and it's not meant to have that comic book in it for, I use the example 10 years. That's a bad example. Let's say 20 years. Okay, depending on how you're storing that comic book, the condition you're storing in, the humidity that got to it, whether or not it was shaken during shipment, whether or not you shook it, whether or not you moved and you forgot that your comic books were shaken in the back. There could be lots of reasons why that comic book could be a lower grade. And in my opinion, as a person who wants to buy collectibles from companies like CGC from time to time, or at least have that mean something, it better be an accurate grade to what's in that book anytime that they've taken it out and looked at it. Plain and simple. Otherwise, what are we even doing?
Right. No, I hear you. And like I said, I don't want to be, and this is the other thing. I thought for a long time, I've believed that reholders should cost more than the actual grade, the actual original holder, right? It shouldn't be cheaper for me to send my book back, not be looked at, and be re-slabbed.
Yeah.
Because the slab cracked. Now, I have two caveats to that statement that I will make as well. If UPS cracks it, or USPS or whoever the hell they've shipped it back to with me, then I should not take a hit on a book getting damaged by them. So they need to make sure the insurance is right, because I've had that go wrong.
Yeah. The difference should be attributed to the collector that sent the book in.
Right. And two, when I send something in to be reholdered, it really should just be a clamp on. There shouldn't be a taking it out, putting it in something new, taking a label off of the census, putting a new census, readjusting the census. It should just be a clamp in. And that's not what they do.
Yeah.
So not re-examining is essentially doing half the job. If I paid $50 the first time, I don't have a problem paying $100 the second time, if you're going to ensure to me that everything I got is the exact same and it's the exact same way. Right?
Yeah. And in fact, let me jump ahead. We're past the hour, and we're probably going to go a little bit over still. And that's fine. I want to get some of these comments. Fine for me. I don't know if you're fine, Kyle.
I will be
for a little bit. Okay. So,
well, no, I'm good. I have a headache and I'm going to have to sneeze soon.
Yeah. And I'm for those that don't know, I'm home alone with my daughter right now, and she's upstairs watching a movie. And I don't want to leave her for too long, but I want to go a little bit here just to get some of these points. Not long enough to answer Kyle's question in private chat. But here's the thing. When it comes to, totally lost my train of thought, completely out the window. Yeah. So when it comes to the solutions, we'll start talking about that. Just anyway, we'll go back to some of these comments. But when it comes to solutions, if the inner well had some really awesome sealing system that CGC could determine if it was cracked or not, I think that they try to portray that there isn't, that there is a system in place like that. But I think we've learned that there probably isn't, based on what we know now.
You mean
it
like
should
if
have like some sort of
sealed?
like. Yeah, it should be some sort of tamper-proof seal that that CGC should know if it was removed or not. And if they take that inner well out, and there should be a unique number on that inner well, and if they reholder that to a new slab, and you want to say book was not regraded, reslabbed as graded in the grader's notes for that well inside, awesome. I'm cool with that, because then the collector down the line can be like, okay, I know this book was reholdered at one point, but not regraded. Fine. Right. That's fine.
Yeah. And I like the idea of, if you're going to do that, like they do with your iPhone, right? Like, they know if you've had your iPhone in too much humidity. They've got such sensitive moisture sensors.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of things you could do to do that. That would be fantastic. And I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. And like Rob Brother says, an NFC sticker is 19 cents. And probably even less when you buy it in bulk. I imagine.
If you buy 1 million of them, it's not going to cost you 19 cents.
And I think that, that's kind of an important point that I wanted to get to when it comes to, I think, you talk about ways to prevent this from happening. I do think that, as a rule of thumb, unless there's some sort of thing like what we just talked about, when CGC is reholdering books, though, they should be looking into this, into it, to see that it's the same book, to see that there's no effery afoot, and you could say effery stands for forgery if you want to. Or you could think it stands for something else.
Tomfoolery.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Some TF-ery. And I think that's an important point. But I do want to get to some of these other comments. Let's see here. Going through some of the other starred ones.
Well, so
go ahead.
Well, no, you're good. You're ahead of me. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that I think that Stevie B's comment here about the going back to the deli man having an accurate tear weight setting on his meat scale is a very accurate point of view. And that goes in a little bit about what Kyle talked about with the gas pump. There are standards of weights and measures, and the reason why those things exist is because there's money involved and we're charging a value for something. And you can make the argument that should extend to collectibles as well to a certain degree, and that there is no real oversight occurring there, I think is maybe kind of the important point. Now, whether or not there should be is a different question, but I think it's an interesting question to raise at least, and maybe to leave the chat with something to think about when they leave this. Speaking of effery, play shenanigans going on at CGC, we become accustomed to just accepting a certain level of corruption in society as a whole. I agree with the spirit of your statement, and I tend to personally agree that if you thought CGC or any grading company, I don't pick on just CGC, if you thought that they were batting 1,000 every time on their grading, I hope this was a wake-up call for those people that thought that, because just like talk about CBCS, and we're going to get to that in a second because people are talking about CBCS. CBCS had a scandal a couple years ago, if you're not familiar, because they do the signature authentication using Beckett technology. If you're not familiar, Beckett is the parent company of CBCS. They have that signature authentication software. They say it's sort of a proprietary method where somebody manually reviews it, plus and or authentication software. Somebody submitted a Sarah Pacelli signature on a book that was apparently, and we have to take their word for it because they're the one making the YouTube video, but they're admitting to a crime when they say this, forged Sarah Pacelli's signature and sent it to CBCS. CBCS sent them a yellow label authenticated back that it was a authentic label, authentic signature. Well, obviously it wasn't, if that person is telling the truth, because they showed themselves practicing and doing the signature and sending it in. Now, that there's that kind of factor for you. Now you should at least know the odds of a CBCS yellow label authentication signature being 100% accurate is a ideal and not a reality. The idea that CGC, when they encapsulate a book, is 100% authenticating what's in there. Same thing with this. They are saying that they have been determined that this is not accurate. So they are themselves saying that they are not 100% accurate all the time. And you at least know that, and you can kind of go down from there.
Beckett's new software will, from what I understand from having talked to them about it, fix that problem 99.8% of the time.
That's awesome.
However,
that's
also how you get Terminators. They're using an amount of machine learning to fix that problem of being able to fool their system. And the 2% of the time will be auto pen, is basically what they're saying, is when somebody uses an auto pen, that's when they won't be able to tell.
And let's be fair, they were using machine learning before for that. I mean, I don't know that definitively, but I can pretty much guarantee that it was, there was some AI going into that.
That with the new AI, they've increased their.
Sure.
Anyway,
and I believe it. I believe that that's true.
Because I do a lot of signature authentication outside of the experience, and I've used their software, and it was clearly breakable because I've broken it. Well, it's not Todd McFarlane's fault that a signature is easily copyable, except that it is Todd McFarlane's fault that a signature is easily copyable.
Yeah, I mean, there are some signatures out there. If you really start and look at some signatures out there, there's some ones where I would say good luck, so short of an auto pen, good luck copying them. And there's some other ones out there where I'd say, it's probably anybody could forge that signature.
Right. I'm looking at you, John Romita Jr. And You know, that's why Ryan Stegman draws the dinosaur.
Yeah.
Because it makes his signature that much harder to copy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I real fast though, I do want to get to this comment before we end the show. And I'm going to redirect you, Murdoch, back to our show, To Slab or Not to Slab, because I think that we did a good job explaining that then. But I think that casting the idea that people shouldn't or should not buy things in plastic or not, you got to leave that up to the buyer, because clearly there's a demand for it. And look, I want my comics encapsulated to a certain degree. Not all of them, some of them, some very important ones to me. And it's not because I want to sell them, but it's because I might want my family to sell them someday. Or more importantly, they might want to sell them someday. What I'm talking about is in the case of my death. I do not want my family trying to figure out what grade my 20 most valuable comics are in my collection that they might want to sell to take care of themselves for the future. And I think there's a lot of people, talk about the long-term investment approach that Kyle made. If you're buying an Amazing Fantasy 15 because you think Spider-Man's an awesome character and you want to have that in your family as kind of like a piece of art or something that has generational wealth that could be attributed to it, awesome. I have no problem with that idea. I'd prefer people that are collectors want to buy it, because that's what's going to keep the value of comics going up, is more collectors wanting to buy comic books to own them. But it's also part of the equation.
Right.
Well, okay. Kyle, do you want to pick the next one that you think we need to hit up? Because I want to.
No.
Well, they do have some. They don't have a complete set of guidelines, which is what you really need.
What I want, and this is what I want in relation to this. I want every book that gets graded to come with a grade card. Period.
That'd be cool.
Right? Every book that gets graded comes with a grade card. Now, there's, these guys that don't believe that CGC has 2 different graders look at each book, or CBCS has 3, or whatever the hell. Right? Those grade cards, what each grader saw as wrong or right, should be written down and sent to you as part of this process. Again, I don't mind paying for it, right? I don't mind paying an extra $10 so that these are available to me. But I need to be able to know, okay, this grader saw a tick here that this grader didn't see. And this grader saw a fold here that grader didn't see. And this grader saw fingerprints that grader didn't see. Because otherwise, again, I have 1, no recourse when something comes back odd. And 2, I have no way of knowing whether or not I'm sending books out that actually deserve to be graded. Right? If I'm, especially as a dealer, sending books out that I want to see appreciate because I'm going to sell them as a dealer, I need to know why it comes back the way it comes back so I can tell the customer, oh, well, this book came back at a 6.5 because it doesn't have the Marvel value stamp.
Yeah.
Or because there's a tear on the back corner or whatever. And I may not have seen that when I initially assessed the book. Right? It's hard sometimes to catch everything.
I'd argue without that context, the grade is meaningless in some circumstances.
Right. So,
and I think that, by the way, Mark, your comment, I'm skipping ahead to that because I think it relates to a lot of what we just talked about. And I think that that might be true for you, and that might be how you view the world, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily true for everybody. Because there are collectors, like I know one guy who is the biggest J. Scott Campbell fan in the world, and he sure as heck is buying yellow label 9.8 J. Scott Campbell books because he loves yellow label J. Scott Campbell signed books, not because he's trying to speculate on them for something. So you gotta people. There's a big reason why companies like CGC and CBCS, like, they change their labels every once in a while. They have custom labels. Collectors in general really care about things like the packaging and that something comes in. And when you have somebody who likes the Spidey custom labels, or they like collecting different custom labels, or they like having all their comics graded by one company, so all the labels match because they have like low grade OCD or high grade OCD. The same way that people that collect DVDs and Blu-rays like it when all the seasons match, the spines all look the same and all that stuff, right? Or the graphic novels and the trade paperback series you're reading, when they change the way the Marvel logo looks on a volume 8, you get irritated because it doesn't match on your bookshelf, right? There's reasons why people do these things.
Real quick, before we go there, can you imagine the fine art appraiser examining a painting, making a declaration regarding authenticity, and then sealing the painting to prevent it from further examination? So that kind of happens, TJ. Malcolm Gladwell on his podcast Revisionist History did a big number of episodes about the high art world and about the number of fakes and scams and stuff that happen in the high art world. And one of the things that sort of happens is when these museums get a piece, before they accept the piece, they have their own appraiser examine it to determine its authenticity. But if your in-house appraiser is a impressionist expert and you get a sculpture, that's a little bit tougher, right? For them to do. So what happens is that once these things are determined to be real, they're put on display, but you can't get close enough to look at if they're real. You can't look at the back of the frame. You can't look at the canvas. You can't do any of that stuff. So you, as a viewer, have to accept that they're real. What was happening, and this happened especially in Europe, especially in the early 1900s, really up through the mid 1900s, is these museums would get these paintings and then they would put fakes up because they didn't have the security they have now to keep these things safe. So now these museums are creating fakes to display so that the real Van Gogh doesn't have to be on display so until they can protect it properly, right? Like, there are a number of things that have happened in that world that we could stand to learn from.
Yeah, for sure.
But there are a number of things that have happened in that world that are the same things we're dealing with now. So, needless to say, it doesn't just happen in fine art.
Well, and on top of that, just think about it from an apples to apples comparison standpoint, which is to say that it's not apples to apples, which is the authenticity of the art isn't the only, like, the authenticity of the comic isn't the only thing in question from a grading and encapsulation standpoint. Because if I verify that it's a certain condition,
right,
and then you take it home and you don't bag and board it, then
right,
yeah,
I can verify that every one of the ASM 300s on that list are probably real ASM 300s. But are the conditions they're in on that list accurate is kind of our question of the day.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, it's not an apples to apples, but it is.
Right. There are things like you said, and I love that idea, talking about the solution side of things, that there are things from like the sports card world, from art authentication and verification. There are lessons that can be learned there that could attribute to the solutions for these issues for sure. And
why don't they grade OA pages? They do.
Yeah.
CGC doesn't, I don't think, but other people do.
Yeah, and then there's you can get them encapsulated with a no grade, I believe, through CGC, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry if I'm misremembering that. But they can still be encapsulated, and then I think that they could also probably do a yellow label if it was signed. Maybe I'm kind of guessing there. I'm not sure about that. Speaking outside my wheelhouse, but
that'd be a question for a Nick or a Bill Cox type. Some of these people who are more into the OA world. I mean, I collect a bunch of original art. I got some more today that just came in, but I frame everything. I don't grade it, so it's kind of a different. I don't really participate in that part of the world.
So this I think is kind of the last important topic to me about this is CBCS going to gain a market share. Stargazer says they're switching over, and the only thing I want to say about this is what matters to me is I have said many times, when it comes to the world of comic book grading, you have two major players, and one of them is by far the Coke to the Pepsi, and that is CGC CBCS, and there are a couple other grading companies out there. I want to see a third powerful competitor in that space, and that's a whole different topic. It's a whole different thing, but I want to see competition out there. And here's why. Because when CGC made some mistakes, they had some huge turnaround times, like 6 months to a year to 14 months for some of the turnaround times that were coming out of CGC during the height of their demand. And some scandals that happened. People mentioned acetate gate. People mentioned there's other things that happened that I won't get into the nitty gritty on right now.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I think it's bullshit that publishers are not communicating to these grading companies what they're printing. So again, if Marvel authorizes a exclusive for a store, that information should just travel to CGC and CBCS and everybody else.
And those grading companies should be establishing that relationship as well. I mean,
right.
I think that's also on them a little bit to not verify it, but it's on both of them really.
Right. But it's the same. And this goes into a whole other thing that like I'm on right now in the comic world, which is the data from publishers to sellers to distributors to everybody's trying to keep everything such a hush hush secret that no one is talking. And as a result, nobody knows anything.
Yeah.
So if Marvel just had the balls to open up a line with CGC and CBCS that says, every month we're going to send you a data packet, or every week we're going to send you a data packet with every single thing we print. And you just have it and you store it in your servers. And then when that book comes in to be graded, now you have that information, whether or not it's legit or not. It solves a whole lot of problems.
I would argue that that's more on CGC, CBCS, those companies to reach out and make that connection, but it's in both companies' best interest to have it out there.
Who starts the conversation is irrelevant, but it should be, anyway.
Yeah, I think it's in the hobby's best interest in general. So for this, though, what I'll tell you is that CBCS had 3 or so major moments where the momentum could have shifted over to them, where they needed to make a push to try to take on CGC for extra market share or extra recognition within the hobby. And they shot themselves in the foot in several of those cases. If you're not familiar with the CBCS scandal, I've mentioned CBCS has other scandals, guys. They sent a bunch of comic books to a residence of a contract employee, essentially, off-site outside of their vault to live there during a move that they had. There are lots of situations where I think CBCS needs to do better. And I don't think, if you want to try CBCS, of course, never a better time, right? And hopefully I do want CBCS to grow. I want them to be more one-to-one with CGC, but I also want them to earn that as a company. And I hope they do. But I think they have some stuff to prove as well. We are getting, we're approaching the 90-minute mark, Kyle.
Let's power. There's only a couple more that we wanted to mention here. Is there a guide to professional ethics or professional ethical practices? I'm sure that each company has what they consider their business practices, their SOP. Whether or not those are standardized across the industry is probably not.
No, I would say definitely not.
Yeah, definitely not. I'm sure there are some the same because they've had crossover of people. But the reality of it is that professional ethical practices really come down to the professional ethics of the people committing the practices. Yeah. So, we had a big fallout. We had a big argument a few weeks ago when we did the LCS health check, and people didn't love what I consider to be some of my normal practices as a retailer. And that's fine. But my professional ethical practices are mine, and they're different than others. And so the question of what's right and what's wrong is much grayer. Now, that said, if these companies were providing a standardized rubric, right? So this is what CGC grades on. This is what they look for. This is how they look. Here's your grade card. Okay. Well, here's CBCS's list. Here's what they look for. Here's what they grade on. Here's their grade card. You could establish some of these things universally, right? they're definitely going to look at each other and try to hold each other, right? Try and be similar enough. So I think you could, but right now there aren't, because again, everybody's so secretive.
Yeah. And that's a problem in this case, where at least to me as a customer, and I know to a lot of other people, transparency would get you more points than secret business practices or secret sauce. Is probably earning them, when, to be let's be honest, the same guy founded both companies essentially. So for the main two. So how much difference is there really? Ooh, that sounds cool.
I could see it especially for books that you're encapsulating for purposes of preservation.
Yeah, exactly. I love watching those time lapse.
Yeah. The guys who make the tables are wild.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Hey, so real fast, I do have to jump, but I want to talk about, even if Kyle needs to keep going for a few minutes or whatever, I do want to talk about something, which is next week. Yeah, guys, we're back. We're going to be here next week. We're going to be here with the topic of AI art and controversy in AI art. Now, please keep in mind, Kyle and I might shift topics at any given moment if we figure out there's something like this.
I know we have a great topic that just got submitted to us by Stevie B.
Nice.
Because we had talked about it before, but he mentioned it on the Comic Collectibles show earlier. So
right on.
That may come up next week, or we may stick with our AI topic for next week, but we will definitely get to Stevie B's comment or Stevie B's question.
Cool.
Jay, throw that link up in the chat, guys. If you have questions or comments or things that you think we should be talking about, throw them in the chat, or follow the link, put them, bit.ly/devil's advocates. Throw it up in there, and
yeah, we'd love to hear about it, guys. Because like I've said before, we want to talk about stuff that you guys want to listen to us talk about. Mostly, occasionally we want to talk about passion projects, but that's important to us. I mean, we can argue about anything. Let us argue about the stuff that you folks want to hear us talk about. And I really appreciate the maturity with which people approach this topic in chat. I want to give you guys a shout out in chat. I know this is a heated topic, and I know that there's a lot of people that are foaming at the mouth, chomping at the bit about certain aspects of some of this stuff, and you guys handled it professionally, and I really appreciate that, because I think that's the way, let's say somebody from CGC were just to watch this video on the rewind, and if you are doing that, please leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you, whether you work for CGC or not. But yeah, we'd love to have, anybody reading this discussion visually, if you will, walk away with things that they could learn from, do better, because that makes the hobby better. And that's the important part of all of this, is that, like I said earlier, we want to leave the taste in the community's mouth that things should be getting better. And how can we make it better? How can we try to create the world that we want to live in for comic books? And I think that's important.
Right. So, I mean, just the couple of things that I want to hit at the end, and we can wrap up really quickly, is an NFC sticker would also fix the problem. It would, but this idea of them falling off the census is not great, because just because I have a book sitting in my house for 5 years doesn't mean it doesn't belong in the census, and they can be read and duplicated. So figuring out how to do that in a non-duplicable way would be part of it. Yeah.
I mean, unique holograms. I mean, NFT, blockchain technology, which would not be, in this case, would not be applied as a market factor, but as a unique identifier. I mean, there's lots of different ways.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to fix this.
I mean, if only if CGC was owned by some giant mega corporation like, I don't know, Blackstone, that could put a bunch of money towards solving this problem.
Well, and they will. Like, that's the thing too. Like, Blackstone might strip mine companies, but they're going to spend money fixing it, because they don't make any money if no one trusts their companies.
The only counterpoint I'll make to that is they care more about the bottom line. So if people don't react to this the way like we're talking like they will now, like if nobody loses faith in CGC and they keep submitting just like they were before,
right?
I don't think anything really will happen other than the
They
comments
will
we've received
because
so far.
people are also litigious.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair. If the lawsuits start to flow like wine, you will start to see some additional measures taken, and that's what I hope happens. I hope we do get, not the suing part. I mean, it's part of life in America, but I do hope that we do see things improve for collectors. Whether you like CGC or not, whether you like grading collectibles or not, it is a part of the hobby that I think is not going anywhere anytime soon. So we may as well have the best version of it that we can have, right?
Right. So the question that we need to answer at the last minute of the show here: should I get something graded as a collectible and not for resale? If my answer has always been the same. If you're getting something encapsulated, graded or otherwise, in an effort to preserve something that you want to own forever, then it's always a good way to spend money. Right? Especially if you're like me and so many of your books just won't hold up in bags and boards for very long, right? Because they're that old. But if that's the way you're into it, you want to collect something, it's never a bad way to spend money doing something that will preserve your collection. It's why we spend so much on bags and boards. It's why we spend so much on boxes. It's why we spend so much on, all of these different things to protect our comics. If you're doing it because at the end of the day, you want to have your books go up in value so that someone later down the line can sell them, then now is maybe not the best time. I'm not going to say don't do it, because as we've covered, there are a billion reasons to grade books, right? There are a billion reasons why you want these companies to be trustworthy. There are a lot of reasons why you would want that, right? But I maybe would wait a little while right now. I think that what you're going to see in this business of grading comics is a not small amount of upheaval coming out of this, right? Maybe some delays, maybe some price increases, a number of things that will contribute to those factors, that will be contributing factors as to whether or not it's a good idea.
Hopefully what we'd see, and this would be the best case scenario in some ways, is some kind of update to the slab that is an additional security measure. Some of the things we talked about in chat, some of the things that you can kind of imagine, some kind of maybe physical change to the slab to preserve an extra layer of security as far as integrity of what's inside. But what I have to say about that, and it's a great point. Here's my answer to the topic. I think that this has changed my opinion of whether or not to grade collectibles. Essentially not at all, because this is the kind of stuff I expected was already happening.
Right.
And it depends on your perspective of what you really thought was going on behind the scenes and what kind of expectations you had for what a label from CGC meant. It's the same opinion I have about CBCS, by the way. And my opinion on the different grading companies is actually different based on reputation and based on their own capabilities. But I would say, and this is again, when Kyle and I talked about the topic originally, we had some different opinions on this. I would actually say that encapsulating a comic book for preservation is not something I would ever do. It is not the best way to preserve a comic book. I don't think it's going to hurt a comic book to do that, especially if you do it carefully. And that's something we talked about in that episode as well. But to me, there are much better ways to preserve a comic book. Archival supplies, you can still use the absorbing paper and all that type of stuff inside the micro chamber paper, whatever they call it. Name escapes me off the top of my head, but there are different ways to preserve a comic book. Look at how places like the Library of Congress preserve their collectibles, for example, and they have topics about this, by the way, because they preserve comic books. Fun fact, they don't preserve them in CGC slabs. But anyways, the point is, I think that it's kind of oversold that it's protecting, and I think it's kind of oversold that it's damaging your comic book long term too. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and I do think that there's even better options than that, Reef. But yeah, anyways, the point is that I think that if you had an original expectation of what CGC could offer you, and this type of thing wasn't in the mix for what you could expect as an outcome from buying like a CGC collectible, I think that you probably had a skewed perception of what reality is often like when it comes to services like this, based on their transparency, based on the communication they've put out in the past, based on some of the things that have been out there in the past. The unfortunate part is that not everybody can do that kind of research or dive into this topic as much, and they might just assume that things are on the up and up, and that it is trustworthy. And by the way, trustworthy is a very sliding scale. I'd say that probably 99% of collectibles that go through CGC, or a very high number, a higher percentage of collectibles that go through CGC, are probably graded accurately, no mechanical errors, no effery afoot, which forgery, tomfoolery, whatever you want to call it. So I think that really it's that edge cases, it's the weird little things that can happen, it's the mistakes that are made. I mean, let's just say that, here's the other example I want to give you. If you're okay with the idea that a comic book came back a 9.0, and really it was a 6.0, and the grader or the person who is responsible for getting that comic book in that process into its case has dyscalculia, which is the numeric version of dyslexia, and really it was supposed to be a 6.0, and you got a 9.0, that could happen, and that could have always happened. And if you are okay with that, then you should be okay with the idea of grading comic books.
Right.
If you have a problem with it, you shouldn't do it.
So, just to wrap up here, Sean asked, why is CGC considered more prestigious than CBCS? I think part of it is because they were first. I think part of it is, like, I don't know how many people know this, but every LCD screen you own was made by one of 4 companies. Doesn't matter what the name is at the bottom. One of 4. There are 4 companies that make LCD screens. Right? Mm-hmm. So whether you buy a Sony, a Samsung, a Vizio, or whatever, when you buy a TV, you're probably buying the same product with a different name at the bottom.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a level of what we used to call, when I was in retail, brand loyalty, right? I knew who my Sony guys were. So yes, we're gonna do that in just a second here, Derek.
She's good. I just talked to her. She's good. She's brushing her teeth and getting her pajamas on, and we're gonna do our bedtime story routine where I'm gonna read her a comic book, folks. So don't worry. It's all gonna be great.
Do not read her The Devil That Wears My Face.
Well, now I gotta find a new book to read. No, we're gonna read Max Meow, which is a comic book that I really recommend for kiddos. So
it's a good one. I buy that for all my nephews.
Yeah.
Anyway. No, so yeah, it's a brand preference thing at this point. Yeah. Like, I don't think there's a huge benefit one way or the other to picking a company. It just becomes a brand preference thing.
Yeah, it's brand preference, name recognition. It's the dumbest reason, but it's part of what I mentioned earlier. People like the labels more.
Yeah. Oh, that's in here. A lot of people.
If you don't think that's a huge part of it out there in comic book land, watch any time that labels get discussed when it comes to comic books, and people will tell you hands down they prefer the CGC labels even over the new CBCS labels, which are controversial at best. And that's the weird thing, is right. It's the packaging, and I say that like it's a silly thing, but it actually is a real deal.
Right. So Sean, to draw an analogy from the guitar world, it's why you would rather have a Mexican made Fender than a Taiwanese made Fender. They're the same guitar. They're just brand preference.
By the way, you can also, this is my last point on this thing, because we didn't talk about this, and I think it should be mentioned. This also has a lot to do with like Mark Jeweller's variants, right? Which when you talk about preference on collectibles, a lot of this has to do with Mark Jeweller's, and it's something that, we've talked a little bit about before, but there's another element to this that is brand preference. People want, for whatever reason, a Mark Jeweller's variant. Now, I happen to be part of the minority that thinks Mark Jeweller's variants are cool. I don't really pay a premium for them, but that definitely ties into this. And I think that's another thing that, you talk about the packaging and the reasoning for all this. That's something that we had to mention, because at some point somebody was going to bring it up.
Frog Brawler, I'm with you, man, on the Japanese. Just throwing it out there. Anyway, no. Like I said, we can get into Mark Jeweller's another time, and I can go get the short box full of them because they're not rare. But whatever.
I think they're fun, but yeah, I mean, that comes out of the thing where it's like, if you're a collector and you think they're cool, awesome.
Right.
If you don't, don't pay more for them.
So, like I said, I think we've really covered this, end to end. We haven't answered, can you trust CGC? But the answer is could you ever?
Right.
And the answer was no. So at the end of the day, nothing has changed except for the way we perceive this process. We, for a long time, considered it to be infallible as an industry. We just kind of even though we knew it was fallible and even though we had different levels of trust, you couldn't really trust it. So
it depends on what you want to get out of it. And the same is still true today.
Right. That's the end of the page, right? You get out what you want to get out on these things. And if you don't trust it, don't buy it. Like, that's the end of the day too. Like, if you are looking at one of these books and you're going, I don't know, man, something seems fishy. Probably is. Don't buy it. So,
hey, love all the comments I'm seeing rolling through about the great conversation and everything too. I'm so glad you guys enjoy the show. Do me a favor, and this is something I don't say nearly enough. If you enjoyed the show, do me this huge favor. Go click share down below and go right now and go into your Facebook groups, go into your Google chats, your Instagram group chats. I know I'm part of probably approximately 300 of those different groups out there. Go let them know that we're having these kind of conversations over here. I'd love to see them in the chat talking to us. I'd love to see them over here on the EXP as we're gearing up for the new EXP Expo that's coming up here soon.
Well, we hadn't announced that yet, but I guess we're announcing it.
Well, I spoiled it, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But it's only going to happen if you tell your friends and share with them, and we get enough of the word of mouth out there, and then we're going to offer some really cool content for people. If you do that, the more people we have over here watching the stuff, the more kinds of cool stuff we can do, and I want to see you over here. So thanks for doing that, everybody.
Absolutely. Good night to Bronze's daughter. Good night to all of you. Sleep well. Sleep well. I'm going to go home and not sleep because I don't. And see everybody next time.
Have a great night.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.